Joining me now by Skype is Janice Purical, McGuffin's defense attorney. Janice, thank you for coming on with us. First off, your reaction to your client's release overnight.
We were really surprised by the news. We were not expecting it yesterday, and everyone was just so thrilled to see him walk out of that prison. It was really nice for us to be able to walk him out of the prison and get him home in time for Christmas with his family.
And so backing up to that DNA evidence that overturned his conviction, kind of explain to me from your side of things how that all factored into this changing for McGuffin.
The post-conviction court recognized that there was exculpatory DNA evidence in the case that had not been reported. And actually at trial, the jury was told that there was no such evidence. So the post-conviction court overturned Mr. McGuffin's conviction based on that exculpatory DNA evidence. And then the Department of Justice decided not to appeal that ruling, and the district attorney agreed to dismiss the charges, and the case was closed at that point.
And so I spoke with OSP, as you know, on that DNA evidence. And what they explained to me is that based on technology back when it was first processed and technology now, that it wasn't a matter, they say, of providing that evidence. They said from the beginning that they gave that evidence up, that DNA evidence. It's that the technology to process that DNA evidence back then compared to now is much different, and back then it didn't show, there was a margin of error, if you will, that didn't give them confidence to say that, you know, give the court this medical opinion on who it could belong to or what DNA type evidence it was, versus when it was reprocessed, they said, you know, technology has obviously improved and it was able to dig deeper into that DNA evidence and show that it was an unknown male's DNA. So what is your response to their explanation of things? That they say it's not that they withheld it, they gave it from the beginning. They just said that the technology has improved to process it.
We know that DNA technology has advanced quite a bit over the years. The real issue here is that if we have cases, whether it's in Oregon or any part of the country, where there's DNA evidence that could shed light on what actually happened and tell us if we have innocent people in prison, we need to go back and find that evidence, and we need to bring it to light. That's really the big point here, is that we don't know how many other people there are in Oregon prisons who have DNA evidence that was never disclosed or reported.
Mm-hmm. And that makes total sense what you're saying. Going back to OSP's point, though, they said that they didn't withhold that evidence. I know it was also cited in the judge's opinion, I believe, that I'm paraphrasing, I might not be using the correct words, but that the evidence was withheld or what have you. OSP says they didn't withhold it. So in this specific case, though, do you hold the OSP crime lab technicians responsible? Do you still believe that they withheld that information, that DNA evidence? Because exculpatory would mean that it would exonerate your client. And yes, his conviction was overturned. However, the DNA evidence, according to OSP, when it was reprocessed with this more advanced DNA technology, all they said is that it revealed it was an unknown male, not that it belonged to someone specific or that was the person who killed Miss Freeman many years ago. So where do you stand on that?
We actually don't know who the DNA belongs to. The post-conviction court specifically found that it was exculpatory DNA, but we don't know who it belongs to. That's still a question out there. What happened in this case was that what was disclosed originally in 2000 was the underlying data that's created when you do a DNA test. So it's just a series of charts and numbers, and you would need a DNA expert to actually tell you what it meant. What wasn't reported was the fact that those DNA experts from our state crime lab saw that there was DNA in that sample. So nobody knew except for those folks at the lab. And then what happened was 10 years later, in 2010, 2011, when this case went to trial, DNA had advanced, and the lab technicians should have at that point re-looked at the DNA evidence and reported it for trial. And instead that didn't happen. So it didn't actually come to light, and it wasn't actually reported until we got into the post-conviction case.
So as far as your stance on this with OSP, do you believe that they purposely withheld that evidence? Do you think that they just mishandled it? How would you characterize their responsibility in all this?
I would say that the state lab definitely mishandled this case. We would have expected that if they had seen any indication of a possible DNA contributor, that they would have disclosed that much information at least, even if they didn't know that it was truly a profile that they could match to a person or not. We would expect them to at least say that there was something there, and that didn't happen.
Now, with that being said, do you have any plans? I know it's a kind of a magic 8-ball that you'd have to look into to answer this, but given that you had the concerns of this DNA evidence being mishandled by the state crime lab, are you going to look at other murder cases or cases involving DNA evidence where the state crime lab processed it and see in certain cases, if those convictions might need to also be overturned, or if these cases are still pending, if that DNA evidence should be reprocessed?
Nick's case is a great example of why we need to focus on forensic evidence in criminal cases. And my nonprofit, the Forensic Justice Project, is specifically set up to be able to look at these cases and find out if there is evidence that needed to be either reported and wasn't reported, or if there was science that was brought into the courtroom that wasn't accurate and gave a false impression about what happened in the case. That's what the purpose of the Forensic Justice Project is.
So what was your client's kind of reaction last night when you met him outside of prison? Outside of the work camp, I should say.
Nick was pretty overwhelmed. This was a surprise to everyone yesterday. He was really eager to get home to his daughter and to spend some time reuniting with her.
So moving forward, his case was dismissed. It's not going to be tried again. So do you consider your client innocent?
I absolutely consider my client innocent. It's not just a matter of the exculpatory DNA evidence that tells us that. It's the entire picture. So we know that the timeline never made sense in this case. There were over 20 witnesses who saw Mr. McGuffin when he was supposedly committing this murder. There are all kinds of other pieces of information that just never got put together for the jury. And had they put all of that together with the exculpatory DNA evidence, the jury would have seen that Mr. McGuffin is innocent. And at this point, Mr. McGuffin is innocent. We all have a presumption of innocence, and now that his conviction has been overturned, his presumption of innocence is restored, and he gets to go back to rebuilding his life.
So are you going to be filing anything in the courts to recover any sort of monetary, is he going to be suing the state to recover money lost and such for being imprisoned for, 9 years?
He was wrongfully imprisoned for 9 years. We don't know at this point what the next steps are going to be. It's really early to tell, and right now we're just enjoying the fact that he gets to have Christmas with his family.
So when we speak of justice being served, there are multiple parties involved here, obviously. Your client, whose conviction was overturned, and as well as the victim who was killed in this case. So what happens now that the person who was convicted and then the conviction was overturned, yes, he did serve prison time for the killing. What about the victims? I suppose one could argue there's multiple victims in this case, including your client. What happens to the person's family who was killed in this case? Is there really justice? Should there be a search again? Should the DNA be looked at more? Should all the evidence that you're talking about that wasn't given to the jury be looked at again, and this case, this investigation reopened to find who actually did kill that victim?
I don't believe that justice was served in this case, not for the victim, not for the victim's family, and certainly not for my client, Mr. McGuffin. I would hope that now that we know that there is exculpatory DNA evidence in the case, that law enforcement would look at this case again with fresh eyes and want to figure out what actually happened.
All right, any final words?
We're just thrilled for Nick and his whole family, and we are so happy and privileged to be a part of his life.